Okay, so like I said, I'm going to focus this lecture on writing a scientific manuscript somewhat in general, and then talking specifics about the methods section in particular. And then I'm going to walk you through some of the basics of formatting methods and results section in APA. Writing up statistical analysis in APA can be a little bit nitpicky, but with a few resources at your disposal, it shouldn't be the hardest thing in the world to get a handle on. So, starting off with some general pointers on the writing of a scientific manuscript. One misconception that I think exists about scientific writing is that it has to inherently be a boring piece of jargon-laden nonsense that is completely inaccessible to other people. It often is that way, but that's not really the goal. It's that way somewhat inadvertently due to the nature of what scientific writing is trying to communicate. But as with many pieces of writing, scientific writing and writing up research manuscripts is all about persuasion. But what does it mean to persuade people in a scientific manuscript? Basically, you're trying to argue your point that you conducted a really compelling research study and found really cool results. The reason I believe scientific writing can sometimes seem boring, dense, and just full of all these difficult details and analyses and numbers is because the heart of persuasion comes down to who you're trying to convince of what. Scientific writing is often so dense and detailed because it is scientific communication for the scientific audience, right? Who reads scientific journals? Typically, it's other people in the field. And so how do you convince your fellow scientists in the field that your research is compelling and worth paying attention to? Well, typically, it's through the detail that you include. By including those really compelling, to scientists at least, pieces of your research methodology and your cool analyses and your cool results. So scientific writing is often inadvertently sort of difficult for non-expert audiences because in order to get into a science journal, you sort of have to convince that audience. The reason there's so much detail is because fellow scientists, typically they sort of want to check your work. They want to know exactly what you did so that they could replicate it, or they sort of understand specifically what it is that you did. But scientific writing doesn't inherently need to rely on really overly difficult jargon that's not defined or explained. It doesn't need to rely on that sort of awkward, boring, and stilted passive voice. You can use active voice. You can say, I did this research, I did this analysis, here's what I found. That makes writing a little bit easier to read and a little bit more compelling. It used to be the case that you had to use passive voice, but that is a passé standard. I would highly recommend relying a lot more so on your active voice because it's easier to read. There's a fine line to be straddled, though, in that you do need to sort of have it be polished to an extent where it sort of is a nice, coherent, sort of, well put together package. And it does need to have like some level of formality, but it doesn't need to read like a freaking biology textbook from the 1920s. So there's a middle ground there. So don't think of it like you have to, or that you should go completely casual, like it's a conversation. That would be more so the tone for maybe like a Q&A section that you're having. For a paper, I would compare it to a lecture presentation. So it's something that is sort of polished and put together. It sort of appears like a finished product, but it needs to be something that's still compelling for your audience to read. So all of this is to say that, yes, scientific writing can sometimes seem dull, hard to write, hard to read, but there's a reason it is the way it is. When we're talking scientific manuscripts, you tend to see a pretty consistent structure that you could compare to a bit of an hourglass shape. You might be familiar with graphics like this from even like a writing course that wasn't necessarily scientifically oriented. A lot of paper structures have a sort of open, broad, get specific to support your thesis, and then broaden out your conclusions. So lots of different styles of writing share that structure. the specifics of what you're putting in those sections for scientific writing is a little bit more sort of, it's going to follow this basic structure. So when we say start broad, this is essentially your large pitch of what you believe is the important question to be addressed. You introduce your topic kind of broadly, saying, here's what I'm interested in, and here's why I think it's important. Often in scientific writing, this will involve a background literature review where you basically synthesize the pre-existing literature to basically set yourself up for what's the specific research that you're going to do. You want to sort of open the door for yourself to pitch why the specific study you did was interesting and worthwhile. Then the results section is, again, all of those detail-oriented, nitpicky things like the specific scales you use, the specific research method, the specific analyses, and all your numerical outcomes. Then from there, you broaden it back out. Why is all that specific stuff I did in the middle actually helping address the question I set myself up for in the intro? So then you conclude that you accomplished something here. So you see this basic structure whenever you're learning about the content and flow of scientific writing. Okay, so again, to reiterate, typically it's going to start broad. An introduction section is to set yourself up and sort of create an argument for why your research is important. Now, for your 293 paper, you're not going to need to have an introduction. So that's great, because that's, in my experience, kind of one of the trickier parts to write, actually. You might not think that from where you're sitting because you're so used to maybe results sections that are incomprehensible to you. It's actually the introduction that's harder to write because you have to do background reading and you need to put together a literature review. So that's more so going to be what you accomplish in 294. How do you write a paper and how you write an introduction? You don't really need to worry about that. But if you're ever reading a paper, often the introduction is where you're going to get that broad scale sort of information. What you are going to need to write up are your materials, your methods, and your procedure, so the specifics of the study that you ran, as well as your results. So you're going to be doing an analysis. You're going to need to include those results. And you are going to write just a really short discussion or conclusion section, like a page or two, where you basically sum up what it is you found. Did you find any significant results? If not, why not? And then maybe propose future studies. So that section shouldn't be too hard to write. Mostly this paper is going to be all about those methods and results sections. In this lecture, I also have a whole bunch of links throughout the slides and in the notes. So if you're ever sort of struggling to get started and you're looking for some basic tips and tricks, I would recommend reviewing this lecture because I've got lots of tips and tricks out here that you can lean on to try and make your writing as effective as possible. So things like avoiding the passive voice and using an active voice, that's a great tip. Avoiding wordiness, again, this might seem counterintuitive. You might think, don't I want my papers to be as impressively worded with the biggest words I can find possible? No, absolutely not. Not looking for that. That's not the goal. The goal is to show me what you know about your research and analyses. So I don't want a whole bunch of wordiness. I don't want a bunch of thesaurus $500 words. We're not looking for that. So being concise is a skill, and it's really important to figure out the most efficient way to communicate, because using a lot of unnecessary words, I mean, it just kind of pisses the reader off. It just wastes time. Feel me? Now, in the context of this lecture, since I am talking about writing, I do want to touch on paraphrasing before I get into the specifics of a method section and APA style, because I want you to never plagiarize in your life, this class included. Conducting or engaging in acts of academic dishonesty, hopefully you know, is a tremendously bad idea. The likelihood that you'll get caught and have to go to an academic hearing is pretty substantial. And even accidentally plagiarizing can be problematic. So you really want to make sure you know how to avoid it. The basic way to avoid plagiarism or copying language without proper attribution or citation is to learn about paraphrasing. It might feel like, okay, I know what paraphrasing is. you always got to make sure, because some people don't exactly know what paraphrasing is. Some people think that paraphrasing means just replacing a word or two in a quote that you copied and then you're done. Not that at all. That is completely insufficient. Paraphrasing is restating things completely in your own words. So you do not copy a quote into your paper unless you're literally throwing it into quotation marks. And even then, you want to minimize your usage of quotation marks, because almost always there's a way to put things in your own words. So paraphrasing is all about thinking to yourself, how can I put this in my own words? If you ever catch yourself saying, I don't think there's a way to put this in my own words, most of the time, there are exceptions, but most of the time, you're wrong. You're just going to be putting it in different words from what you originally read, and that's okay. I'm not looking for your writing to be the caliber of prolifically published scientific writers. I want it to be in your own words. That's what I'm looking for, and that's what I want. So paraphrasing is about reading your material, your source material, putting it away, and thinking to yourself, what do I know? What did I learn? And then just writing it from scratch. So paraphrasing, it's really important. It's as simple as closing the background sources that you're reading and then beginning to write. That's the easiest way to make sure you're not goofing and doing a little bit of accidental plagiarism. Accidental plagiarism is still plagiarism. So if you're sort of like, oh God, have I been paraphrasing adequately? Don't worry, there's lots of background resources that you can consult to make sure that you do this effectively. So again, I've got some links here to some articles on effective paraphrasing and avoiding plagiarism. And so if you think to yourself, I want to refresh on making sure I'm paraphrasing correctly, definitely visit these sources before you start writing. You definitely want to make sure you're not engaging in any of the classic ineffective paraphrasing strategies that some people think mistakenly constitutes paraphrasing. So things like taking a quote from a resource, switching out a couple words, that does not constitute proper paraphrasing. That's not putting things in your own words. It's using the author's words and then sort of sloppily going to the thesaurus. It doesn't work that way. Including proper in-text citations. So if you got your information from another source, you cite it. It's really important to cite your sources. You need both of these things to properly paraphrase and to properly cite your sources and to not engage in plagiarism. You need to paraphrase and you need the citations. You need both. Again, I've had students who they say, well, I didn't think I was plagiarizing because I included the in-text citation when it was a whole wall of text that they copied from that source. Doesn't work that way. You need both. You need to both paraphrase and use in-text citation to make sure you're doing this adequately. Okay, are there any questions so far? All right, let's move on to the specifics of writing a methods section. So basically, as I mentioned, your paper is gonna dive right into the methods section, sort of that more detail specific area of your research paper. You don't need to do an introduction, you just need to dive right in. So I'm gonna show you some examples from a real research paper to demonstrate a few things throughout the remainder of this lecture. And I'm also going to show you, again, some background sources that you can use to acquaint yourself with these concepts. So the paper I'm going to be using as an example is on one of my favorite topics, which is the psychology of nostalgia. And so I'm going to be picking from this paper a little bit and showing you facets of the methods and results section to show you sort of what you're shooting for. So this particular paper, if you're interested, you can read a little bit more about it. Essentially, these researchers were interested in the extent to which nostalgia sort of made you feel like a more authentic person. The idea being that you kind of reflect on your cherished memories and it puts you more in tune with the person who you really are inside. So it's a really neat paper, and it's got some pretty easy to digest methods and results sections. So one thing you're definitely going to want in your methods section is at least a paragraph on your participants. You don't have your participants yet, so if you're going to write a mid-semester draft, you can basically write how many participants you're shooting for and how you're going to recruit them and any demographic characteristics you're looking for. Once you have your final paper at the end of the semester, after you've analyzed your data, you're going to fill this information in with your specific sample size, as well as how you recruited them and any relevant demographic information, including the gender breakdown, the age, mean and standard deviation, and any other information you think is relevant, like perhaps ethnicity breakdown. So then, additionally, within the methods section, you tend to see this materials and procedure section. The way that this methods section is set up is not a hard and fast rule. You can have a standalone materials and procedure section. In this case, method is the sort of main heading and participants is one subheading, materials and procedure is another. I think that that's a pretty good breakdown, but you can play with the subheadings if you want. Materials and procedure is basically what all went into the survey that you conducted. So key things you're going to want to include in this section are basically what are the scales you used. So you're going to describe the survey, you're going to name the scale that you used, and you're going to include some key information about it. You're going to want to indicate what the response format is that you used. This right here gives you an example of the proper APA format for writing up a response format. And additionally, you're going to want to include what we call a sample item. This is just one specific question from the scale. This is a great example of a time when it is appropriate to use a quotation, because the point of including a sample item is to give the reader a sense of what your scale looked like. So it's meant to be a representative question from the scale, but since you didn't write this, you didn't write the scale, likely, you would want to put that in quotes, and you would want to include an in-text citation for the people who authored that scale. Once we do our data analysis, we're going to have more information, descriptive statistics about your scales, so internal reliability, mean and standard deviation, but obviously you don't have that stuff just yet. But you do know which scales are going to be used. The sample items, you just have to choose one, and what response format you're going to be using. Okay, so again, the basic breakdown, participants. Here are some bullet points you can hit to fill out your participant section, basic information you would want to include about your participants. Again, at this point, if you don't have that information because you haven't collected your data yet, you can either leave that information blank or you can write in the characteristics you're looking for. Procedure, as opposed to materials, is sort of how the study is being administered. So basically, this is your surveys being done online. You can also talk about how it's being distributed, how you're sharing it. That sort of information likely goes into the procedure. And then materials is the actual content of the survey you conducted. So this is where you would discuss the scales you asked, the questions you asked. If you're using pre-published, make sure to cite it and include a sample item. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talking about APA style. So APA style basically governs the formatting for scientific papers in the field of psychology. It's a little bit nitpicky, and getting it perfectly right is a little bit tricky, particularly because the 7th edition was newly released this past year and some of the rules have changed. So I'm not going to be a stickler about like getting it perfectly right, but you do have to sort of give it a try and try your best. And if there's any mistakes, I can give you feedback. So if you make like a tiny mistake, like you forgot to italicize something or something minor like that, it's not going to cost you major points, but do try your best because it is valuable to get acquainted with a formatting style. So since APA can be kind of a pain in the ass to get a handle on, and since you guys didn't have to buy the APA manual, I included lots of links to resources in a standalone Canvas module. So some basic writing resources, so things like formatting your title page, running head, all of that junk. And then some additional resources on reporting statistics. So there are formatting rules on how you actually write up the results for your analyses, what numerical outcomes need to be reported and how you format them, and tables and figures. you're going to need to include at least one table or figure in your final paper. And so there are some formatting rules around that. So I'm going to walk through a few of these specific features right now, but if you do want more information, there's lots of available resources that you can just find on the internet. You don't need to have an APA manual in your hand to get this stuff right. Okay, so for example, in terms of formatting your paper, kind of more generally, various Purdue resources can walk you through what all needs to be included. So for example, you are going to ultimately need a title page when you submit your final manuscript in a few weeks. So basic information on the title page is going to be the title of your paper, your name, your institution, things like including page numbers and a running head. All of that sort of stuff has been sort of slightly tweaked in APA 7. Some things, even on the title page, have changed. So again, just try your best to copy whatever template you find, even if it's slightly out of date or if there's a minor mistake, that's fine. Just try your best. And certain basic things obviously need to be there, like a title and your name. In terms of your references section, to properly cite a source and avoid plagiarism, as I mentioned, you need to paraphrase and include an in-text citation when you cite the relevant information in the body of your paper. You additionally need to have a references section at the end of the paper that includes the full version of the citation. There's a different way to create an in-text citation versus a reference section citation, and the basic format is listed here. And again, it's pretty easy to find templates for your APA citation generation. You could even use the citation generation in PsycInfo. Like I mentioned, sometimes there's a little mistake in there, but they're typically pretty minor. As long as you double check and make sure that it looks good, you should be able to use the PsycInfo citation generation. But this is the basic formatting for your citations. In-text citations, as I mentioned, are a little bit different. These are shorter, and they are just going to be the last names of the authors in the manuscript and the year. There's slightly different ways that you can incorporate your in-text citation depending on how you're writing up any particular sentence. So sometimes you can have the author's names incorporated into the main text of the sentence. If, let's say, they are the person engaging in the action in the sentence you write. So that top example, according to Jones, APA style is a difficult citation format for first-time learners, right? Jones is the actor in that sentence, which is fine. That's active voice, it sounds fine. In that case, then you would just have the year in parentheses to complete that in-text citation. If, though, the wording of your sentence makes it more easy to have the information about the citation completely in parentheses, it would look a little bit something like that. APA style is difficult citation format for first-time learners, and then Jones and the year is in the parentheses. For most journal articles, you're not going to need the page number with your in-text citation. You would need that if you were citing like a chapter from a book. Typically, you would need a page number. Most of your in-text citations, assuming most of your sources are academic publications and journals, likely it's just going to be authors, last names, and the year. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics, tables, and figures in APA. This is, again, kind of nitpicky, but since we're primarily focusing this paper on results and analyses, you would want to get a handle on reporting statistics in APA. This is the sort of thing where you basically have a consistent structure for what needs to be reported, like which numerical values need to be reported, and then little things like how do you label them, what gets italicized, how are things spaced. So again, there's plenty of resources, a couple of which are linked here, on reporting your statistical analyses in APA. So for example, there's standards on how you would even write up a mean and a standard deviation. So the example there gives you that format. Basically, you include that numerical information in parentheses and then little things like it's an italicized capital M for the mean and an italicized capital SD for standard deviation. These are the kinds of things where you just sort of need to take a look at an example, take a look at a template to know how exactly you report that information. So definitely looking at these resources will help you figure out what you're supposed to be including. In that same resource that I linked in that previous slide, there's a really great write-up for all of the APA formatting for specific statistical analyses. So for the rest of the semester, we're basically just going to be learning different inferential statistical analyses. They're all a little bit different. They're all used for slightly different purposes, and they have different obtained statistical outcomes. So the values you report are a little bit different when you're doing a correlation versus when you're doing a t-test. So you're definitely going to be doing a correlation over the course of your project. So you're definitely going to want to remember this information here. Essentially, for a correlational analysis using a Pearson's R, it's as easy as a lowercase italicized r with your degrees of freedom in parentheses. And then that number you see there, that 0.49, that's your R value. And then you need a p-value. And the P is typically italicized. Again, all sorts of nitpicky little things, but once you sort of take a look at a few examples, it becomes a lot easier for this to become sort of second nature. You're additionally going to do a supplemental analysis, so either a t-test or an ANOVA, so definitely I would keep this article in your back pocket and refer back to it when you're writing your paper. So then graphics, on the other hand, APA graphics you can think about as being either tables or figures. And these are two different approaches for visualizing your data. And there's different little bits of APA formatting that go into each. The basic difference between a table and a figure is that a table depicts numerical information. If, for example, you want to include more numerical information than is appropriate just in text, you just slap all that information into a table so it's a little bit easier for the reader to understand, as opposed to just having sentences upon sentences filled with numbers. Slap all that stuff into a standalone table and then just say, see table 1. So a table might look something like this, and I'll show you some other examples as well. Figures, on the other hand, are going to be your graphs, so bar chart, histogram, line chart, pie chart. All of that is more so what we would call a figure. Okay, so here's a couple examples of some APA formatted figures. So here you see a bar chart. Some of the APA formatting is going to be things that are actually really important, not just nitpicky. So things like titling your table, that's kind of important. Things like including any notes that you need. For example, if you need to include information on like any flagged statistical outcomes. So if you're flagging any bar that's statistically significantly different from the others, you might include a note saying that those will be denoted by an asterisk. Relevant information can go down here in the notes. Things like labeling your axes, that's obviously important because if you neglect that, your table is sort of incomprehensible. Things like creating a legend so that your reader knows what these different bars mean, that's all pretty important. So all of that goes into properly formatting your table. Same thing, sort of graphic to graphic. No matter what graphic you're choosing, the basic ideas are the same, making sure that it's clear to the reader what is being depicted, creating titles, labels, and explaining what the graphic depicts, and making it just sort of easy to look at and understand. Okay, tables, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is going to be more so about the depiction of numerical information. And again, there's APA formatting that goes into creating the properly formatted APA table, some of which is really important. So things like labeling what the columns mean, having a title for the table, including any relevant notes or citations. Other sorts of stylistic features of proper APA formatting includes things like, notice how there's no lines separating all of these various cells. Basically, to create a table like this, it just takes a little bit of Microsoft Office wizardry. It's not that hard. And when we get to the end of the semester, I'm happy to show you how to do this. Basically, you just create a table in Microsoft Word, you get rid of all the borders, and then you go back and you insert these sort of lines dividing the title from the columns here. It only takes a few minutes, and again, it's the sort of thing that it's a little bit nitpicky, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that hard. And then going back to that nostalgia paper example, this paper includes what I would consider a really ideal graphic that you guys might want to copy for when you're reporting your analyses. So one of the studies in that paper was correlational, and they included what we would call a correlation matrix, which we're going to learn more about next week when we talk about correlations. So this is a table, but the information included here has space for the descriptive values and a correlation matrix that shows you the correlations between a series of variables. So if you only have one correlational analysis, like a single R value, it's pretty easy to just write that in text. If you have any more than that, like if you're putting at least 3 variables into a correlation, creating a matrix like this makes it a lot easier to not have to write a whole bunch of numbers into text. So again, I'm going to talk about correlational matrices next week as well. But this right here, I always tell students if they're struggling to think of a graphic, I'm like, use this example right here because this is, in my opinion, a really effective way of communicating the same kind of information you guys will need to communicate. So that does it for my lecture. I'll just show you real quick. I do have an instructions document on Canvas to give you guidelines for creating a methods section. Again, you're not going to have to turn in a mid-semester draft, but I will create a optional assignment open next week if you do want to get my feedback. So it's completely up to you. I would highly recommend at least starting this section of the paper to, again, save yourself some time later on down the road. And if you want to get my feedback, this is your opportunity to do it, because if it's the last week of class and you're like, hey, can you read my rough draft? Unfortunately, the answer is no, because there's never going to be enough time for me to read 25 rough drafts. This is an opportunity, though, for me to give you feedback when I'm able to do so. All right, so that does it for my spiel. I'm going to quit the recording and then happy to take any questions or check-ins.